بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم. Alhamdulillah, today in the Tafsīr we completed the Tafsīr of Sūrah al-Talāq. As we look and reflect over Sūrah al-Talāq, we notice that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He begins the surah regarding something that is very human, the issue of divorce and rulings and the amr. This is a key word that we're going to use today, the amr, the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This word amr comes in the surah in multiple places. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals His amr and command about divorce. So you start off with the surah and you kind of very zoomed in. It's microscopic into the very domestic lives of human beings. And then as the surah comes to its conclusion, basically starting from where we started our tafsir today, you feel the effect of now the surah is zooming out. So we started very zoomed in, focused on a particular issue, which was the issue of divorce. And then we zoomed out, right, all the way back until we saw, all the way out until we saw 7 heavens and 7 earths. And it's all connected together. So the issue of divorce and the rulings regarding divorce are just some of the amr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, some of the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're pertaining to the domestic life of human beings, does not change the fact that they are still from the amr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they're still from the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nor does it change the fact that they are conveyed to us via a human being change the fact that they are the amr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's where we started from today. وَكَأَيٍّ مِّن قَرْيَةٍ عَتَتْ عَنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّهَا وَرُسُلِهِ. That there were many a township that transgressed against عَنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّهَا. Right? The word amr comes there. The command of its Lord and His Messenger. So the fact that the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is received through a messenger who is a human being does not make it such that, okay, now I can choose to disobey because this is a human being. Disobedience to the Rasul, who is a human, is tantamount to disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now the wording in this ayah is very general, right? That they disobeyed the amr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now whether that amr and that command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is something that has to do with how a government should run, whether it has to do with how finances should be conducted, whether it has something to do with what a Muslim is supposed to believe about the world, about the universe at large, as we see towards the end of the surah, or it has to do with something that is as microscopic and human as divorce. All of these are the amr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and disobedience to any one of these commands, right, leads to destruction. Right? And this is where Sheikh Amin, he spoke about how we view human history. Right? So we look at human history through the lens of ultimate fate. What was the ultimate fate of these civilizations? If the actions that they carried out and they executed brought down from the heavens a divine judgment of punishment, then that civilization was unsuccessful. This is where Sheikh Amin mentioned that it is human actions that bring down either the madad, the help and the assistance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or they bring down the adab and the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If it's the punishment that came down and that was their ultimate fate, then we would say this is a civilization that was, you know, that has left behind no value. They're insignificant. They're not relevant to us because they haven't left anything for us. They were destroyed. Then we moved on to the ayat that talk about ulul albab. Right? And Sheikh Amin, he spoke about the lub being the kernel. And when you talk about levels of intelligence and intellect, there is the intellect that is very superficial, that is surface level, and that is the intellect of the disbeliever and how the disbeliever reads history. You have to connect the ayat together. That's what Sheikh Amin was doing. That the superficial knowledge of history is that a person looks at, okay, this is the architect that the civilization left behind. Yeah. These are the pots and the utensils that they left behind. MashaAllah. So what? What is that? What is, how does that benefit you? What has that done? So, taqwa, the higher level of knowledge, when you use taqwa to read history, that's when you get to that's when you get to the core, right? It's the core, the lub. Okay? The history of the disbeliever is superficial, right? It's focused on just the physical remnants, what, you dig up a site and like, you found this and you found that, okay. But taqwa takes you to the core and says, okay, well, what was the aqibah? What was the fate of these people? What's the message to be read in their story? So taqwa gives you a higher element in any science and any knowledge that you begin to study, right? Whether that be history or otherwise. Right? In this particular context, we are speaking about human history. Right? So this is going beyond that superficial knowledge. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us, فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا قَدْ أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ إِلَيْكُمْ ذِكْرًا, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed to you uh, a dhikr, a remembrance. And Shaykh Amin, he explained dhikr as what? Taking things back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is really beautiful because you look at the fate of human civilizations, you know, you think about, go back to your own, experience in school, how you studied history and so on and so forth. When did that ever lead to dhikr? And if you're a very practicing Muslim, then perhaps, you individually, that might have made you connect things back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But at least at an institutional level, that's not what's done. But that is how history should be taught. And that is how history through a Muslim lens should be seen. That you take human civilizations and you read the message in them, and then that takes you back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You read that message of, well, this was their ultimate fate. And I don't want that to be my ultimate fate. So I should practice taqwa. This is now dhikr. This is now taking things back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As Shaykh Amin mentioned the other ayah, وَإِلَى اللَّهِ تُرْجَعُ الْأُمُورِ. All affairs, all matters go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then after that, we have in the ayah, وَمَن يُؤْمِن بِاللَّهِ وَيَعْمَلْ صَالِحًا. And this is where Shaykh Amin, he introduced the question. I thought it was very nice how he introduced it. Why can't we just be quote unquote normal human beings and enjoy? And we had that discussion about, well, If you look at people that work really hard in this world, doctors, lawyers, and whatever the profession might be, in the beginning you struggle, and then eventually that struggle pays off. Now, for some reason, we celebrate the struggle for enjoyment in this life, but we don't seem to appreciate the struggle that one must take upon themselves so that they can enjoy in the next life. So it's ironic that we can appreciate the struggle that people go through in this world and we celebrate it, but when someone starts to struggle for the sake of the deen, we're skeptical. And sometimes it's not just skeptical, where instead of encouraging them, right, we, we, we seem to tell them to scale it back, which as a believer is very ironic because you would believe that the akhirah has much more value. Then we got into our discussion of the seven earths, right, the seven heavens and the seven earths. Sheikh Hamid made a very important point that in terms of aqidah, all we have to believe is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just as He created seven heavens, He also created seven earths. To know the nature of these seven earths is not something that is binding or obligatory upon us. It would only be so if it was revealed to us through conclusive evidence in revealed sources. If we were told what exactly these seven heavens, seven earths, and seven heavens for that matter are, then we would be obligated to believe that these seven earths and seven heavens have this specific nature. When that is not clarified and mentioned explicitly in revealed sources, then we are not obligated to know the nature of these sciences, of these earths. Okay? And this is now our distinction between science and aqidah, is that the basis of science is your observation and so on and so forth. Uh, the basis of aqidah is, do you find it in the revealed sources? So whatever you find in a revealed source, that is now aqidah. And just a point here that Shaykh Amin I found very subhanallah, it was amazing. He says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the other verse he says أَوَلَمْ يَرَى الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا, meaning don't the disbelievers know, right? And the ayah continues that we created everything from water. So now someone can say, well, they kind of seem to have discovered that at this point now. So how can the Quran say they don't know that? That's the difference. Is this not? We're not talking about it from a scientific perspective. We're not talking about it from just a perspective of observation. You read the whole ayah, وَجَعَلْنَا, that we are the ones who made it. The purpose of saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are the ones who made every living thing from water, is that you recognize that Allah is the creator. Right? So if you have all the science where you figure it out, you've observed and you've rationalized and you've arrived at the process of how living things come from water, but you haven't identified the ultimate cause of that to be Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that's not the same as the aqidah that's found in the ayah. Right? I think that's what Sheikh Amin was trying to get at, that you have to make a differentiation between science and aqidah. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the fact that He created seven heavens and seven earths, what's the thrust of the ayah? The thrust of the ayah is identified in the ayah itself, لِتَعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ, so that you go beyond that superficial knowledge. And it all connects back together. You go beyond that superficial knowledge. It's not just that, okay, there's seven earths, seven heavens, and there's seven earths. But what's the message that you're being asked to read there? You're being asked to read the message of taqwa. You're being asked to read the message that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He did, create seven heavens and seven earths, what does that tell you about the creativity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? About His power to create. And if He's creating it, He knows it. وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ أَحَاطَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عِلْمًا, He's encompassed everything with His knowledge. Now you take this aqidah, so we went from the microscopic beginning in the surah, we zoomed out, all the way to the macro picture where we saw seven, not just, planet Earth. We zoomed out, we saw seven heavens and seven earths. And then you take that macro aqidah, and now you take it back and you insert it into your micro, which is your talaq. Right? That if you recognize that Allah is powerful over everything and He has knowledge of everything, then you'll be able to apply that in your dealings about talaq and taqwa. That if you're going to have taqwa in the issue of talaq, in the issue of divorce, it has to be based on your belief about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He is all capable, that even when things feel like they're constricting around you, Allah has the power to take you out of that situation that seems like there's no way out. And if you doubt the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what you're going through, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's going on in seven heavens and seven earths, right? So you're not above Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knowing what's happening in your life. Right? So you take that macro aqidah and now you're able to apply it into that micro situation that you are going through. And if you guys remember, and we'll end with this inshallah, when we were doing Surah Al-Talāq, I still remember Shaykh Amin, he mentioned this very nice statement. He said, bring your aqidah down from the arsh. Right? Your aqidah is kind of floating there in the arsh, right? You have to bring it down. That's the purpose of it, right? So you take that aqidah and you bring it down into your life so that you can apply it. Right? So we'll end with that, inshallah. Subhanallah, bihamdihi, subhanakallah, bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.